What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four, but we're actually going to sidetrack from Hickman for a second, and we're going to go back to Mark Millar, because with everything that's going to be happening here in the next probably week or two, we're going to be focusing on something called New World, and that was established during Millar's run. So this is very important, especially when we get to the part about Galactus. But the thing about this is that this initially picks up with the Fantastic Four doing Fantastic Four stuff, which is fine. But ultimately, while we're at the Baxter building, you've got Janet Van Dyne, you've got She-Hulk, who operated on the Fantastic Four at one point in time, and then of course you got Susan Storm. One of the things that kind of goes on behind the scenes when it comes to the Fantastic Four comics, and when I say behind the scenes, I mean like in between fights, because the Fantastic Four are kind of like the first family of Marvel Comics, everybody of course knows who they are, they're highly respected, but it's also kind of like friends who hang out with each other. So Susan hanging out with like Janet or She-Hulk or other people who have been involved in the Fantastic Four is not uncommon, but essentially out of nowhere, they're met by the arrival of a woman named Alyssa Moy. Now this is really interesting because when she shows up, she tells Susan like she needs to get a hold of Reed Richards, right? She needs to speak with him directly, but she isn't really giving them any information as to why it is. Now, one of the things to know is that Susan Storm is aware of who Alyssa Moy is. And in fact, Alyssa Moy can best be described as like the female version of Reed, that in fact, her and Reed kind of had a little bit of a thing when they were younger, but Reed ended up basically marrying Susan Storm and has been with her ever since. Now, the funny thing about this is that, of course, Alyssa Moy is depicted as being exceedingly attractive. And when Reed arrives, she's like, hey, so like, we need to go talk about something. There's this project that myself and basically a guy named Ted Castle have been working on, Ted Castle being like this ultra rich billionaire, and we want to show you, but we can't tell everybody what's going on because it would create problems. And so where Reed ends up leaving with Alyssa because Susan Storm doesn't really care. The funny thing about this is that Ben Grimm, you end up finding out Susan Storm does care, because Ben Grimm, in a room full of women, makes this statement that like, man, Alyssa's a lot hotter than I remember. She's like 10 times hotter than I remember her being. Now here's the thing, if you are a guy, you do not tell a room full of women, one of which is married to a particular guy who's leaving with this chick for some kind of a science mission, that the chick he's leaving with is basically hotter than all the girls here. You just don't say that kind of thing. But the kicker about this is that basically Reed is taken to what is essentially a giant oil rig. And when he gets there, he ends up finding out that it's not actually an oil rig, that instead it houses what is in effect a portal to a different place. And when he gets through it, he's taken to a place called New World. That what's going on here is that Ted Castle and Alyssa Moy, along with basically the world's richest men, all came to this realization that the Earth itself will be uninhabitable within like 10 years. Climate change and all that kind of stuff, right? That the Earth has been around for 5 billion years or something like that. It took humanity like 100 years to screw it up, right? And so because of that, she's like, the Earth is not going to be inhabitable, right? Like the Earth is a place that we can't live anymore. And so once we came to this realization, we started working on the New World project. And so basically the world's richest men are bankrolled, really richest individuals, men and women, are bankrolling this entire project. We've got some of the greatest scientific minds in the world working on this, and there's only like 400 people who know that it's actually happening, and we're just now telling you about it. Now, of course, the most logical question has to be asked here, why don't you tell people about this? And it's like, because human beings are human beings, Reed. If we go out there into the world and we say, hey everybody, the Earth is screwed in 10 years because you guys all screwed it up, people are gonna panic, right? People are just gonna experience this massive existential dread. They're gonna freak out and they're basically gonna start looting and everything is gonna go nuts, right? Human beings are gonna do what human beings do in a time of panic. And so as a result of that, they haven't told anybody. The scale of this project is astronomical, right? They've taken trillions of photos of just the city of New York itself, right? Not even taking into account all the other places, and they have perfectly duplicated the world all the way down to the graffiti that's on the walls, right? Just one of these things where it's just a massive undertaking. Now, they're not too far away from it, or at least from completing it, but the reality here is they want to bring Reed on board. They want him to be a part of this. Now, the other part of that, and these are really the kind of questions that have to be asked here, is, well, how's this world going to work? If we literally bioengineer a new world and then nothing ever changes in terms of like governing and how people function and so on and so forth, we're gonna screw this world up in like 100 years. So like, what steps are you guys taking to basically fix all this? And that's when you learn about a program that's called the CAP program. And the idea behind this is that it's kind of modeled after Captain America to a degree, but the overall gist of this is that it's an acronym for conserve and protect, and that this guy would literally patrol around the world and basically take away any weapons that anybody has, right? Like any giant arms, armament, things like that. So it's basically forcing peace on people. Now, human beings being what they are, our history being what it is, humanity would somehow find a way to wage war most likely. However, what they're pitching here is this notion that if you are going to live on this world, you have to cast aside all those old issues. The problem with that is some of these wars that are being fought by societies that hold blood feuds that are so old, they don't even know why they're fighting anymore. They just know it's always been that way, and it's the way that it always will be, right? Like, I hate you because you're from this place, and we've always waged war against people from that place, and that's just how we do things, right? I mean, in a lot of ways, humanity is primitive in that way. But the reality here is it's an effort to basically curb the destructive nature of humanity as a whole. Now, what we also end up learning is that there are basically nightingales in every single hospital, which serve a purpose of also offering a humanitarian aspect from a hospital perspective, right? They have what's called the World Banks, which is basically a sentient AI that essentially guarantees, or at least argues that it can guarantee, a stable economy for at least 1,000 years. They've taken a variety of different steps in order to make sure that this new world can actually function. And so what ends up happening here is that once Reed Richards is sent back to the Baxter building, of course, he can't run around telling everybody this. He does record some of it for his own interest, his own personal gain. But then what you end up having here, and this is going to seem out of nowhere, that what you end up getting here is basically this girl named Cindy. We never learn her last name, but she's basically kind of like a robber, and she ends up just sort of sparking a relationship with Johnny Storm. A lot of that's because Johnny Storm kind of loves the forbidden fruit, right? That kind of a thing where she's like a small-time bank robber, and it's one of those things where Johnny's kind of like, hey, like, I like the bad girl, right? I mean, stop robbing banks, but like, I like the bad girl, and let's kind of see where we can take this, right? That sort of thing. And it's a very passionate, right? Very just hot and heated relationship, and that's essentially it. Now, there is a side plot that takes place with the Cap robot basically escaping confinement and then showing up in the world and then just literally doing everything from, or at least starting with like disarming and dismantling like nuclear stockpiles across the world. The concern is that if it keeps going without being stopped, eventually it'll just track down anybody who's a hunter with a gun or anything along those lines and kill them. Ultimately, it's defeated. And so the concern here about Cap escaping is that the world would become aware of like New World and all that kind of stuff. For the most part, it's not, right? Just once the Cap robot is taken care of, it all just kind of gets swept under the rug. So the general population is none the wiser about what's happening here. And so what you end up getting are a couple different things. The first is a revelation that's established by Alyssa Moy that she never got past Reed Richards, and that in a lot of ways, she was always sort of jealous of Susan because Susan Storm was the one who ended up marrying Reed instead. And she actually makes a move and tries to get Reed to leave Susan Storm behind. This was kind of bookending and sort of leading into the notion of like the Council of Reeds from Jonathan Hickman's run, where for one reason or another, Reed always leaves his family, that kind of a thing, except the main Marvel Universe Reed is basically the one who doesn't. But the other thing that happens is that with their life being busy and hectic and Susan Storm launching her own kind of charity, different things like that, that what they end up doing is hiring a nanny, and the woman who at least responds to an interview, or at least is supposed to have an interview, is a woman named Tabitha. Now, she will become incredibly important over the course of this story. But the thing behind this is that Tabitha, of course, being here and basically waiting for Susan, has spent time with Franklin and Valeria, and they love her, right? I mean, she's like the Mrs. Doubtfire of this Fantastic Four story. They absolutely adore her. But before Susan Storm's able to arrive and really even meet with Tabitha in the first place, Dr. Doom invades the Baxter building. Now, unlike what you would expect where Dr. Doom shows up here with the intention of just tearing things up and ripping things to pieces, instead, this guy looks worse for wear, man. This guy looks pretty abused. Like he just got the crap beat out of him. And so when he shows up here, it's really more looking for help than anything else. Now, of course, you end up having Tabitha who grabs, Franklin and Valeria and basically takes them to where their safe zone is supposed to be, or at least Franklin's one that leads them there. But the thing behind this is that you have Ben Grimm, who initially deals with Dr. Doom, but is suddenly met by a group who are calling themselves the New Defenders. Now, we don't know anything about these guys, but we will. The kicker behind this is that Ben Grimm is a guy who's gone toe-to-toe with like the Incredible Hulk on a multitude of occasions. This guy's on par with Thor, depending on what era of comics you're talking about with Thor. Suffice it to say, this guy's more than enough to defend the Baxter building on his own. The New Defenders, take him out like that. It's this guy called Lightwave that literally just eliminates him in the blink of an eye. He doesn't kill him. He basically just sends him flying out of the Baxter building. At that moment, they end up grabbing Dr. Doom and whisking Dr. Doom away. And so from that point, it's like, where in the world did this guy go? Like, what in the heck is going on here? Now, the other part of this is that when Johnny Storm basically breaks things off with Cindy and the two of them end up going their own separate ways, of course, she's seemingly heartbroken by all of this, but the reality of this is you switch over to where Dr. Doom is being held. Now, the crazy thing about this is they keep talking about a kind of source of power. They keep talking about how they need Dr. Doom. And in fact, there's one of these kind of conversations that take place where they're like, is the plan working? Is it all coming along? Is it supposed to? And one of the individuals basically says, relax, everything's going according to plan. And it's the Incredible Hulk. Right? So whatever's going on here is basically being led by the Incredible Hulk. But here's the thing that I'm going to say, not everything is what it seems, because what you end up doing is switching over to Johnny Storm when he's basically doing his thing and he's suddenly attacked by Lightwave out of nowhere. Now, Lightwave is able to hold his own against Johnny Storm quite readily, but then that's when Cindy steps in, and Cindy's someone who actually has psionic abilities. And in fact, she goes by the name of Psionic, that she had basically been pretending this entire time. She was never the person she claimed to be, and striking up a relationship with Johnny Storm was actually done for the purpose of finding some way to overcome him, secure him, and bring him to the New Defenders. So she was literally working for the New Defenders the entire time. Now, when Johnny Storm figures this out and realizes what's going on, he's basically assaulted by the two of them, but neither of them are able to overpower him because Johnny Storm is ridiculously powerful. And in fact, during Jonathan Hickman's run, we're going to get what is arguably, not even arguably, what is definitively the best moment for Johnny Storm in the entire history of Marvel Comics. God, it's so baller. Those are the guys who read Hickman's Fantastic Four. You know exactly the moment that I'm talking about. It's ridiculously amazing. God, I'm so glad we're going back and remastering this. But the thing about this is that while these two are trying to deal with Johnny and Johnny's getting the upper hand on him, you have what's called the Hooded Man, who seemingly comes out of nowhere and overpowers Johnny Storm and knocks him out. And then as soon as that happens, Johnny's whisked away to the base of the Defenders. Now that's when things start to clear up, right? That's when we start getting answers to so many of these questions that we have. That what they're talking about here, at least with the New Defenders anyway, is they're talking about a machine they built, right? And what we're told is this machine that we're building needs real power, and the job that lies ahead, you guys are good, but your main battery can be found down there right beneath your feet, literally saying we need you as a source of energy to a degree, but the real source of energy that we're going to be tying you into and we're going to be using the three of you for, you're quite literally standing on it. And what we end up finding out is they're standing on the body of Galactus. What ends up happening is the Hulk basically speaks up and starts offering questions. What we end up learning is from what it was that Alyssa Moy had said when it came to the world basically coming to an end, that we're told the world didn't come to an end in 10 years. Instead, because of the fact that Alyssa had met with Reed Richards and told him the world was coming to an end, the actions of Reed and others basically staved off the end of the world for about 500 years, but the end of the world came anyway. Now, when the end of the world was nigh and there was no conceivable way to basically stop the end of things just due to like the total collapse of the Earth's environmental ecosystems, right? Basically, climate change reaching its most logical conclusion, the wealthy and the powerful disappeared overnight. Nobody knew where they went to, and that billions of people had basically starved to death. The world's cities, or at least those that were on coastal waters, were basically drowned in the ocean, that literally it was just a catastrophic global climate end times, right? That's really what it was. And there were superheroes that remained behind, and there were superheroes that tried to help people as best they could. But at the end of the day, it was a losing game. It was only a matter of time before disease, cancers, things like that took what was left of humanity. And so what ended up happening is the Incredible Hulk had basically started working on a system that could be used to essentially fix the problem. I mean, even the moon itself was in shambles, right? Like literally torn asunder. Now, the other thing to keep in mind here, and this is something to know, this is not actually Bruce Banner. Instead, this is Bruce Banner Jr. Now, if the question that you're asking yourself is, doesn't that name sound familiar? It should, because Banner Jr. was the little baby Incredible Hulk that was saved by Old Man Logan in the Old Man Logan storyline. Yes, this ties into Old Man Logan. And in fact, we're going to revisit this because it's really, really cool, because we basically get the fight when they took down Galactus. And in fact, we get this really cool explanation of how it all unfolded in the first place. But the important thing here is that with this situation being what it is, their idea is, okay, well then are we just going to leave Earth and go to a different planet? The Hulk's like, no, we can't go to a different planet. There's not a suitable place for millions of miles, but we do know of a place that we can go to where we can like breathe the air and drink the water and eat the food and so on and so forth. The intention of Banner Jr. is to create what's basically a time machine to send them to the past. The problem with this is they don't have a readily available power source. They've stripped pretty much all the resources from Wakanda because we can largely assume everybody in Wakanda is dead. They basically took whatever resources they could from Attilan because the Inhumans sucked. They're probably overpowered pretty easily. But the thing behind this is they don't have a real power source here. The kicker behind all this is while they were trying to figure this out, Galactus showed up on Earth to consume it. And that's when they realized we can use Galactus as a power source. And so again, the comic that we'll cover later on is the one that takes place in between this, because we immediately just jump to Johnny Storm, who's like, holy cow, you guys overpowered Galactus. Like, you literally mugged this guy, knocked him out, and now you're using him as a source of power. And their response is, yes, because we've literally created a time machine. What we're going to do is we're going to take 8 billion people from the year 2500 in the future that we as the new Defenders come from. We're going to teleport them here to the present day. Now, the crazy thing about this is that it's like you're going to just completely destabilize the entirety of the world as it exists right now. But the response of Banner and Jr. and them is like, we don't care. Like, it's not our concern, right? We want to live. We have a right to life. And so ultimately, we're just going to show up on in your present day era, and we'll find some way to make it work, right? Like somehow it's going to work. But the reality here is it's a last ditch effort. Now, the response of Cindy here is you also have to see the bigger picture, Johnny Storm. Like, if you were in our place, would you not do the same thing? And the idea here is that with them, they're the only ones, like these new Defenders are the only ones that really have the wherewithal to save humanity. They're doing what needs to be done. And so ultimately it's one of those things where literally Johnny's like, okay, like, what do you think, Doom? Right? Like, would you do this? Is this something that you think is reasonable? And Dr. Doom's only response is like, I'll say this, whoever orchestrated this kidnapping will die at my hand tonight, so swears Victor Von Doom. And that's when Johnny's like, you hear that, Hulk? As soon as Doom gets out, he's gonna kill you. And the response of Banner Jr. is, oh, I'm not the one leading the show. I'm the second in command, right? I'm the technical guy. The one who's leading the show is out there. Switch over to Tabitha. And that's when Tabitha starts making her move. That literally Tabitha's like, okay, everything's all sorted out. Johnny Storm's been taken, Dr. Doom has been taken. We have to get the Fantastic Four off the board. So she goes and she visits Reed Richards and starts talking to Reed. And one of those things is kind of like, you should really tell the kids what happened with Johnny and that kind of a thing. And through this sort of conversation, we end up finding out that what Reed Richards has done is he's basically developed this kind of serum that basically injects nanobots into the body so that no matter where a person goes in space and time, they can be tracked down by the Fantastic Four. And really, Reed came up with this because the Fantastic Four, they can time travel, they have time traveled. It makes the most logical sense. But realizing that Reed is already up to this and that if he uses it, he'll be able to find the secret base of the new Defenders before they can execute their plan, the Tabitha takes out Reed Richards by bringing down this giant piece of machinery and sending it crashing onto Reed. And then following that, she contacts Franklin in his room and says, hey, you're gonna hear some noises out here, Franklin. Everything's cool, don't worry about it. I have the machine set up so it'll give you as much candy as you want and you can watch anything you want on TV, right? Because Tabitha is aware of the fact that Franklin Richards can alter reality. And so keeping him distracted and keeping him removed basically ensures their plan can go off without a hitch. And so following that, she ends up coming across Ben Grimm and Jennifer Walters, She-Hulk, and then immediately incapacitates the two of them by creating a force field and sending them flying into the sky. And so once she ends up catching up to Susan and catching up to Valeria, that's when Susan starts to realize what's going on here, and she picks up on who it is that Tabitha is. That Tabitha is not Tabitha. Tabitha is Susan Storm from the future, when basically the entirety of society had collapsed. And that for Tabitha, Reed Richards and like Franklin and Valeria, that they had seemingly done what they could. Now, Franklin does not seem to have gained the level of power that he would gain later on when he became like a universal shaper and a reality warper and all that kind of stuff. Hence the reason why Franklin was unable to save the world, because I know you guys are going to ask that question. But the other part of this is, given the various technologies of Reed, that they were able to prolong the life of the members of the Fantastic Four Four, at the very least, that seems to be the case. But that seems to be the explanation of why it is that Susan is 500 years in the future and isn't that much older. Now, again, we're also kind of making some hypothesis here because we don't definitively know if she survived 500 years or if it was jumping back and forth in time or whatever it is. But the important thing is she's more adept at her powers than modern day Susan, and so she's able to overpower her. And when that happens, she goes back to the base of operations for the new defenders, basically informing them the Fantastic Four are now off the board. We don't need to worry about them. Now, what's really crazy here, and this is a genius bit of writing, Reed Richards puts 2 and 2 together. Those little nanobots that he created, once they're injected, they can never be removed. And so he injects Susan Storm and the rest of the Fantastic Four with those bots in the moment here and now. And using those, Tabitha immediately pops up on the radar, right? Susan immediately pops up on the radar. Now, the question was asked, like, how in the world were you able to do that? Now, here's one thing to understand, that when it comes to the future in Marvel Comics, comic writers will come along and they will say, this is the definitive future. So in this hypothetical scenario right here, or this situation, in 500 years, the Earth will definitively become uninhabitable. That there's no conceivable way to stop that. That will be the definitive future of Earth in Marvel Comics until another writer comes along and says, we found some way to basically stop the issues of climate change and the world is saved and it's not going to end in 500 years. The reason why that matters is because with that being the guaranteed future, it means it is guaranteed Susan Storm from 500 years in the future will come back to the past and basically try to set up events or create events where they can use Doctor Doom and Johnny Storm and Galactus as a source of power. Meaning, if Reed injects Susan right now in the present day with those nanobots, she will have them 500 years in the future because they can never be removed. Hence the reason why they showed up, or at least he was able to find future Susan in this point in time. I hope that's clear as mud. But what it does is it's basically just Mark Millar giving himself an out and giving himself a way to kind of get out of the hole that he wrote of the base of operations for the new Defenders cannot be found under any definable means by anybody whatsoever, because Susan is at least capable enough to outwit Reed Richards because she knows what it is that he's capable of, that kind of a thing. But what you end up doing is, of course, having the Fantastic Four that show up on the scene in the new Defenders building. And there is a bit of a fight that takes place. It's not an overly massive one. I mean, it is cool to see, but one of the things that we learn here is that this guy, the quote-unquote stepfather of Banner Jr., is actually Wolverine. Now, it has not been solidified that this is Old Man Logan. We can kind of allude to it to a degree given the confines of the story. It's not until you get into Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four run that you learn that is Old Man Logan. But I kind of assume by the time we get around to that, you guys will have forgotten. So I decided to include it here, to be honest with you guys. But in effect, each one of these guys are basically kind of taken out and defeated in different ways. And so the Fantastic Four, for the most part, kind of come out on top, but they've constructed an alternate plan. Because one of the things to know here is that the new Defenders are fighting for their survival and the survival of humanity 500 years in the future in order to bring them back to the modern day. That what you also have is the Fantastic Four who are trying to prevent that from happening, but there is a third option. That there was a point when Susan had dinner with Alyssa, and what Alyssa had revealed to Susan Storm is that she was lied to by Ted Castle. That building New World and using the intelligence of Alyssa in order to do it was not done for the purpose of saving all of humanity. That in this 500 years in the future, when Banner Jr. was telling his story and saying the rich and the powerful disappeared overnight, it's because they went to New World. That's actually what it was being built for. It was being built as a place where the ultra rich and the powerful could go and basically continue surviving, while everybody else, basically all the remnants of humanity, were just left down on Earth to starve and rot and die. And so when that revelation was given to Susan Storm, she came up with a plan. That what they're actually doing here, that where she's literally fighting future Susan, and future Susan is like, this is a fight for survival. Like, if you stop us, our people will die. Susan's response is, not quite. And what had happened is she had worked alongside Alyssa to create a teleportation system that, with New World having already been finished, because again, it was going to be done in like a couple weeks or so there's obviously a bit of a time skip here, that with New World basically being completed and just waiting for the ultra rich to arrive there whenever things become uninhabitable on Earth, that what Susan and Alyssa did is they teleported the 8 billion citizens from the far-flung future on a dead world to the present day on New World, and that's where they reside. Now, it pisses off Ted Castle to no end because it basically destroys all the plans that he had, and of course all this money, as far as the rich and the powerful were concerned, was completely and totally wasted because none of what they had shot for is actually coming to fruition. But the important thing is that this future is saved, right? The people in that world are saved. Now, this story may seem like it doesn't necessarily have a point. It does, because this will become ridiculously important later on down the the line during Hickman's Fantastic Four run. But as for future Susan, because the question now has to be asked, how can you have two Susan Storms running around at the same time? The answer is that you don't, right? That Galactus is basically destroyed, right? This is Galactus from the future, that he's basically destroyed. This is something that I want you to be aware of, or I want you to keep in the back of your head, because this dead body of Galactus will be revisited during Hickman's run. It's one of the other reasons why I wanted to cover this, because if we didn't do this and then we jumped into that story, it wouldn't make any sense. But basically, the body of Galactus is dead. It's just sitting down underground, deep beneath Earth. And then what you end up having is Susan Storm, the future Susan, who approaches Victor Von Doom and apologizes for having kidnapped him. But Dr. Doom maintains his promise. Remember, he said, whoever orchestrated this kidnapping will die at my hands tonight. And so when Susan Storm approaches him to apologize, he completely incinerates her, right? Just kills her on the spot. And when everybody's like, what did you do, man? He was like, I restored my honor. I kept my promise. Only a fool would kidnap Dr. Doom and expect that there would be no consequences for it. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Thank you all for watching. We will pick up next week back with Hickman's Fantastic Four, and I will catch you all later. Peace.